The Middle East is on fire, everybody's talking about it. So I thought, why not we have a discussion about it? How resilient do you think the Iranian regime right now is? How strong is it in face of external military pressure?
I think in terms of the external military pressure, it might actually make the regime stronger, at least in the short term, as people rally behind it. And what we've seen now with the selection of Mujtaba Khamenei as the successor to his father, you have a more hardline regime emerging than arguably the one that existed just a few months earlier. So, if the external attack was intended to somehow soften or fracture the regime from within, that does not really seem to be happening. And of course, as it always happens in so many other places as well, when a country is attacked externally, there is an effect known as the rally around the flag effect, so that people who may otherwise have been very much in opposition or willing to protest or very critical of the regime, they too will essentially defer their protest or their anxiety towards the regime until after the military crisis has passed. So I think this attack had the opposite effect. And I think part of the reason why it had the opposite effect was that the United States went in thinking that Iran is simply some kind of a one-dimensional autocracy, where if you eliminate the supreme leader and maybe the few people around the supreme leader, the regime is going to crumble and it's going to collapse, and then the United States and Israel will be able to impose a political settlement of their choice. In actual fact, the Iranian regime has far deeper roots. It's more ideological in nature. It has a huge entrenchment in the society because of Iran's massive public sector. So it's not that simple a question in terms of getting rid of one leader and then the regime is done for. Maybe the Americans were expecting that within the regime, infighting might break out if the supreme leader is assassinated. And this also did not take place. We saw that as per their own constitutional practice, an interim council was swiftly constituted, and that interim council set in motion the process for the selection of the next supreme leader. And the assembly of experts duly met and deliberated and then made its decision. So, this in turn indicates that the institutional structure of the Republic was far more resilient than what the Americans had anticipated. Within this, of course, there is one important critique that we can still make, though, and that is that when you look at the origins of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, it was very much a rebellion against hereditary monarchy. And what we see now with the elevation of Khamenei's son to the post that he occupied, that in a way, the Iranian Republic has become monarchical. It has become a hereditary sort of rule. So this could actually pose very great challenges for it going forward after the crisis has passed. But in the short run, it seems you have a more hardline regime. You have had an orderly transfer of power from the previous ruler to the current ruler, whoever that is, in this case, his son. And the institutional framework has survived the military onslaught against it.
What does it tell us about Iranian culture, Iranian system of governance, Iranian history, the historical forces? When we say that the theocratic regime is also returning towards hereditary form of government, or like succession, or the or power is being transferred down the same line in the same family, does it tell us about a certain like historical fact that, hey, like, you cannot escape your past, you cannot escape your like what happened in the history?
I think when we look at the history of Iran or Persia, what we see is that Iran is in many respects not just a monarchy like others, but it represents the ultimate historical model of a universal monarchy. When we go back to the Achaemenid Empire, what we see is the emergence of an Iranian monarchy, a Persian empire, as it were, under Cyrus. And that Persian empire has a very deep and profound linkage with the religion of Zoroaster. And the relationship between the state and the religious element is quite strong. And over time, what we see is that this pattern is repeated. So when we look at, let's say, the Sassanid Empire, or when we look at the emergence of the Safavids, we again see that there is a very close relationship between what we would consider a theocratic element and a monarchical element. So the nature of the state in Iran for most of its history has been of an ideological nature. That is to say, that there is a universal framework, there is a set of big ideas about truth and justice and morality and how society ought to be organized. And aligned with that great objective or that grand design are different political forces that seek to legitimize themselves and benefit from being viewed as the arbiters and the instruments through which that grand design is going to unfold here on earth. So, the Islamic Republic of Iran, if we look at, let's say, its concept of the rule of the jurist or the state of the jurist, that juristic state is also a very monarchical state because the supreme leader actually has nearly monarchical power. Where the Islamic Revolution differed from the earlier versions of the Iranian monarchical state was that it insisted that there was no need to have the transition of the supreme ruler within the same broad family group. So, in that sense, it was a rebellion against hereditary monarchy, not monarchy itself. But now, again, as we see, it appears that the hereditary element is making a bit of a comeback. So, it's a very interesting development. But in many ways, the Islamic Republic of today has a very deep historical background to it, and it is operating according to parameters that are very much in accordance with the cycles of Iran's history, going all the way back to 600 BC or thereabouts.
So when you talk about that, there are two kinds of like ideological forces at play all the time throughout Iranian history. One is political that complements the ideological or the more religious one. So is it to say that when there was during the time of these Shahs before the revolution, the Pahlavi dynasty, there was this religious element missing?
Well, I would say that when we, let's say, if we look at the Safavids, which is a good example, what we see is that at the
Can you
beginning,
outline the time period of these for us as well?
sure, sure.
Yeah.
The Safavid Empire or the Safavid dynasty ruled Iran from about 1500 to 1722.
Okay.
So they are near contemporaries of the Mughal Empire in South Asia and the Ottomans in the
Ottomans.
rest of the Middle East. So the Safavids actually began as a religious movement amongst the Turkoman tribes. And these Turkoman tribes regarded the Safavid leader not just as their political leader, but as a spiritual leader, as someone who was, in a sense, infallible and incapable of wrongdoing. Once the Safavids had taken over Iran, what we then see is that the Safavid dynasty gradually distanced itself from these more militant Turkoman elements and relied more and more upon the regular Shia ulema of the country for its legitimacy. So you can have this sort of rebalancing, but in both cases, there is a very heavy reliance of the government or of the political regime on the religious forces, either in the form of a sort of militant movement that is bringing it to power. Once it is in power, maybe then it becomes more of a conservative, establishment oriented religious basis. But you see this thing happening throughout the Iranian history. Now, at the same time, uh, we should also bear in mind that during the Pahlavi monarchy, there was an attempt at modernization, both under the first of the Pahlavi Shahs and then under the last of the Pahlavi Shahs, who was then overthrown by the Islamic Republic. So, under the Pahlavi dynasty, there is an attempt to secularize the country, to, in a sense, change the aesthetic of Iran into that of some kind of an imitation of a Western society. And while that does work for a while, and it does produce some beneficial effects overall for the state or the economy, uh, it comes at the price of the Pahlavi monarchs becoming perceived to being stooges of the Western powers. So what then happens is that starting in the 1960s, when opposition to the Pahlavis grow, the religious classes, particularly led by Khomeini, they emerge as the major source of organized opposition to what is, of course, a very nasty police state dominated by its security apparatus, the feared Savak of the Shah of Iran. So then what we see is that when the monarchy is overthrown, although it is overthrown by a constellation of opposition forces, within those opposition forces, it is the theocratic element or the religious element that eventually becomes dominant and then suppresses all the other elements and forms the regime that we are familiar with today. So, this is a very interesting reversal because traditionally the balance of power was in favor of the monarch, and the ulama or the different religious orders who supported the monarch were very important, but they were subordinate to the monarch. Whereas what we see during the Pahlavi period is that the Pahlavi's attempted modernization, in a way, breaks the linkage between the monarchy and the religious classes. And then, when the monarchy is overthrown, the religious classes take over the secular power in the country directly, rather than indirectly through a monarch, as had been the practice prior to 1979.
Okay. So what were the leading factors that led up to the revolution of 1979?
Well, there were, I mean, so many different elements to it. Uh, One was the growing unpopularity of the Shah's regime because of its repressive measures. Some also say that the Shah's attempted modernization also antagonized conservative elements in society. So that was another very important element, that there was a bit of a reaction, if you will. At the same time, the Shah's regime had a very severe lack of legitimacy because you might recall that in the early 1950s, the Shah had been forced to flee Iran, and under Mossadegh, Iran had begun its own transition to a kind of a parliamentary democracy. But then the Americans and the British, they organized a coup and brought the Shah of Iran back into power. So that restoration of the Shah and the overthrow of Iran's nascent democratic system effectively meant that no kind of peaceful parliamentary evolution would have been possible. That if there was going to be political change in Iran, that political change would have to be through violent revolutionary means and mass struggle. So, in that context, you had a very important role being played by the Iranian socialist communist Today party. And then, of course, you also had a even more prominent role eventually being played by the ulama and the conservatives. So, this is, in a sense, what sets the stage for the Islamic Revolution. That in a way, you can understand the Islamic Revolution as a delayed reaction to what happened in 1952-53 when the Shah of Iran is restored by a coup sponsored by the Americans and the British.
When we look at the relationship between Iran and the US right now, it's about war and everything. But initially, was this relationship antagonist? Like from the outset, or was there any attempt to sort of bridge the relationship between US and Iran after the revolution?
I think on this subject, one thing is quite clear, and that is that when the Iranian Revolution occurred, there were two main opinions in Washington, D.C. One opinion was championed by conservatives, including former Richard Nixon, who argued that the United States needs to intervene in Iran in order to restore the Shah and stop the revolution from succeeding. And then there were more uh, liberal elements represented by then President Jimmy Carter, who essentially adopted a hands off approach towards the revolution or the upsurge against the Shah of Iran himself. So, in a way, the Carter administration, by not taking a very, very strong pro Shah stance and intervening, which is what, let's say, people like Nixon were advocating, it allowed for the opposition forces to gather momentum. And it led to the discipline within the Shah's regime cracking once they realized that their great benefactor, the United States, was not going to come to their rescue. So, in that sense, the Iranian Revolution may still have succeeded, even if the United States had intervened in 1979. But I think it would have been a far more difficult task for it to succeed if the United States had not adopted a policy of relative neutrality towards the Iranians at the outset of the revolution. Then, of course, things went badly south for US Iran relations uh, when the extent of the Shah of Iran's crimes were revealed, when it became apparent how deeply the Americans had been involved, not just in providing the overall support to the Shah's regime, but also in terms of micromanaging how the Shah's regime was being operated. So that upsurge of anti American sentiment was then effectively captured by the more conservative elements. And once you had the embassy hostage crisis, it became a matter of prestige, in a sense, for the United States. The attempt by the United States to rescue the hostages using special operations that did not work out as the Americans had planned. That, of course, led to an even bigger blow up in terms of the relationship that could have been between the new government, the new regime, and the United States. And then, of course, there was the very, very strong fact that within the thinking of the Islamic revolutionaries in Iran, there was not just a very strong anti American bent, but there was also a very strong anti Zionist, anti Israel bent as well. So, this is also something which then caused further problems for the Iranians vis a vis the United States. So I would say that, the situation spiraled out of control. The United States decided to then react to the Iranian Revolution by, for example, encouraging the Iraqis to attack Iran.
Hmm.
We know, for example, that the Western powers provided Iraq, I'm sorry, with access to the technology it needed to produce chemical and biological weapons, which later on, of course, they would accuse Iraq of hiding. So uh, all of that, plays into the then locking in, if you will, of the hostility between the two uh, governments or the two systems. So I think that's how it sort of, went haywire right at the beginning. And then as the time passed, the United States became more eager to isolate and sanction and otherwise punish Iran in the hope that these sanctions and hardships would lead to an implosion of the regime. That, of course, has not happened now. It's been, close to 50 years since this American policy was adopted. So the Iranians, for their part, have also become, especially since the American invasion of Iraq and the sort of dismantling of a functioning state in Iraq by the Americans themselves, that has opened the doors to the expansion of Iranian influence, which again further antagonizes the Israelis, who then call upon the Americans to help them, as we're seeing at present as well. So this, has all, snowballed. And one of the things that, of course, stands out is that during this entire period, no American president, despite all the hostility towards Iran and vice versa, no American president was actually prepared to invade Iran or to directly attack it in this manner. But we see now that under the Trump administration, the Israelis seem to have finally found a American government that is actually prepared to go along with the scheme. So
What scheme?
this has led to a further this scheme of trying to bring about the collapse of the Islamic regime in Iran through the direct use of military force.
Why would they
So
want
this is
that?
something that, Benjamin Netanyahu has been advocating since the 1990s. So you can actually go on YouTube and you can actually see him walking since I think 1995 or 1996, that a war against Iran is necessary because they are a few months away or a few years away or a few turns of the keys away from acquiring a nuclear bomb with which they will then threaten Israel. So this has been something which successive Israeli governments, particularly the current one led by Netanyahu, has been advocating for a very long time. But they could not really get any American government to fully go along with this. So let's say when you look at the Obama administration was also given the same advice by the Israelis, but they instead decided to negotiate with Iran and enter into the JCPOA agreement, which then Trump torpedoed as soon as he could once he had come to power. So, so this is a sort of great ambition which the Israelis have had because they view Iran as essentially the only source of a balance of power in the Middle East. All the Arab countries are effectively either beaten or vassal states of the United States or Israel. So the Israelis have really nothing to fear from them. It is only the Iranians that have created a balance of power, if you will, in the Middle East. So if Iran is gone as a functioning state, then you can have a sort of Pax Israel over the whole of the Middle East.
When they talk about the greater Israel and everything, uh, are they really up to it? I mean,
Look, I think people often throw around all sorts of old maps, quoting different sources about where the borders of Greater Israel are or not. I think that's not a very intelligent way to look at the Zionist project. I would essentially argue that Israel actually does not have the demographic depth to physically occupy that whole bunch of territories. It just doesn't have enough people. The total number of Jewish Israelis is maybe 7, 8 million people at most. That's just not enough people to actually
Mm,
carry out such an expansive scheme. What the Israelis, of course, do want is that within the extended Middle East, they should be the dominant military power. They should have the ability to essentially police the region without any local state being able to fight back against them. So the Israeli concept of a greater Israel, I would argue, is more legitimately thought of as a sphere of influence within which the Israelis have hard power dominance over the Arabs. And the only people who are actually challenging this dominance for the last, let's say, 15, 20 years are the Iranians. So if the Iranians go, if the Iranian proxies, as they are known in the West, collapse, if Iran itself is fragmented into warring states or collapses in exhaustion from the bombardment, then what it means is that there is no longer a balance of power in this region. The Israelis can mow the lawn, as they like to say, anywhere, anytime, and nobody is going to fire back. Nobody is going to resist them. If they want to, they can bomb Qatar. Nothing is going to happen to them. We've seen this happening. If they want to, they can send their drones and aircraft into Syria, into Iraq, wherever they want to, basically. So, in a sense, that is what I think the Israelis want out of all of this. Not that they will physically occupy a huge part of the Middle East. You know, if you look at maps, so Greater Israel includes Egypt as well.
mm,
So, I mean, realistically speaking, that's not going to happen. There are just too many Egyptians for the
yeah,
Israelis to conquer in that
yeah.
sense. But Egypt has certainly been dominated by the Israelis. So, when you look at uh, the calculations of the Israelis. So this is remarkable that, you know, with all of their big military budgets and huge armies and all those resources, uh, one of the Arab peoples was being, you know, subjected to genocide live on your phone, basically. And all of the Arab countries were, you know, basically looking left and right and not doing anything about it. In fact, they were even deepening their military cooperation with the Israelis, like the UAE, for example, while all this was happening. So I think this is something which is very much clear from the Israeli side, that what they want is this end state where they are the hegemon in the region, and they can draw upon the back end support of the United States and the Europeans to keep themselves supplied and subsidized, and effectively overwhelm any Arab neighbor that might have any problems with this arrangement.
Why don't they just give the Palestinians the state, and it would all end this enmity between them and, of course, the entire Israeli factions of people in the Middle East? That would not solve the problem for them and for other peoples as well.
Look, one of the things with the so-called two-state solution is that maybe uh, in the 1960s or 70s, that was a viable solution. But the Israelis now have hundreds of thousands of settlers in the West Bank, and they have effectively rendered it impossible in the physical sense for there to be a Palestinian state. So when countries talk about a two-state solution, all those settlers, hand over the territories back to the Palestinians, and live are an equal neighbor or at least a sovereign neighbor. None of those things are going to happen. So, what we can have is therefore the current situation where the Palestinian territories are occupied and subjected to Israeli control. And that control is formally condemned by a whole bunch of people, but there's really nothing anyone is willing to do about it in terms of challenging it on the ground.
Should Pakistan have
And
joined the Peace of Board of Peace?
Pakistan has, I think, joined the Board of Peace. I'm not actually clear as to what is the formal structure of the Board of Peace or how it is actually going to function.
Hmm.
It actually seems quite chaotic in a sense that Trump has been making very wild promises about what the Board of Peace is and what it has to do. His own attention seems to wander quite a lot. So he seems to be focusing on one thing one day and another thing another day. Uh, when it comes to, let's say, contributing, let's say, peacekeepers, for example, this is a topic which has come up repeatedly that, for the situation in Gaza, you might have peacekeepers sent by Muslim countries in order to effectively uh, take over, in a sense, the territory and ensure that Hamas does not come back and the Israelis also then don't have an excuse to come back in. But I really don't think that any peacekeeping force sent into that area can realistically ensure that Hamas does not come back, nor could such a force realistically stop the Israelis from continuing to attack Gaza whenever they feel like it. So again, it's very sort of fuzzy. Frankly, I think a lot of countries have just gone along with the Board of Peace idea in order to win some easy credit with the Trump regime. I doubt that many countries even take this idea particularly seriously. They're just pandering to Trump because they feel that when you pander to Trump's pet projects, he becomes very flexible on a whole bunch of things because he likes to be seen in a certain way. So if you help him cultivate his image in the way that he sees himself or likes to see himself, then he gives you a free pass on a whole bunch of other things which are actually vital to your national interests.
Do you think that America is making a mistake in attacking Iran along with Israel? Because everybody is saying that they're spending a lot of money, a lot of the expensive radars have been hit, and yeah, is it a mistake?
Well, in any such circumstance, there is, of course, a very heavy fog of war. And there is a lot of propaganda being put out by all parties. So, whatever we see on the social media, especially, needs to be taken at a very steep discount. However, when we look at just the reporting from mainstream news channels, from Western newspapers, then what we see is that yes, the United States has suffered major damage to a lot of its prized assets, particularly surveillance and radar assets in the region. Yes, it does appear that the Iranians are getting drones and missiles through the American and allied security net. Yes, it does appear that the Strait of Hormuz is practically closed to shipping, even though Iran has not formally blockaded it. The risk to shipping is such that no one is prepared to take the risk of sending their tankers or their big cargo ships into the region. We also see that there is now a rapid unraveling of the energy markets. Oil is going up, gas is going up. Countries are essentially declaring energy emergencies in order to conserve resources. Nobody knows because of the uncertainty what's going to happen. So this also indicates that the United States went into this war without having actually planned for what's going to happen if the war continues for any length of time. Then what we also see is that there is a horizontal escalation of the conflict, which is something that Iran had warned about consistently about what would happen if it is itself attacked. So when we look at Iraq, when we look at images coming out of Bahrain, when we look at images coming out of Lebanon, what we see is that, in fact, the on ground horizontal escalation of the conflict is taking place. So this is also something which indicates that the Israeli and the American planning had not foreseen or adequately prepared for this outcome. Then within the American decision making, I think there are four groups of people that are pushing Trump in different ways. They are the rational sycophants who are basically telling Trump that you should just declare victory and call it a day. There are the irrational sycophants who are committed to a bigger war with Iran because they genuinely think that they might be able to win a victory over the Iranians. Then there are the more professional elements that remain inside the American state machinery, the defense and state and CIA officials who have been sort of leaking stories to the press about the state of American preparedness,
Mhm.
effectively pointing out that this war is logistically impossible to sustain for more than a short duration of time, in a way making the case that the rational sycophants are making, that since we can't really continue fighting this for an open-ended period, we should call victory and end it now. And then, of course, there are the hardcore, let's say, Christian Zionists, biblical types who believe that this great war against the Iranians is a precursor to the end times or to the rapture or to whatever other thing they might happen to believe in. So you have these four groups, in my opinion, that are pulling Trump in different directions. And it's very interesting that you can actually see this push and pull on Trump just by looking at his tweets. So at one moment, Trump is demanding that Iran unconditionally surrender. At the next moment, he is saying that Iran has already unconditionally surrendered after the Iranian president, in a way, apologized to the Gulf states for the Iranian drone and missile activity against them. So you see that in a way that I think the American decision making right now is fractured, it is in chaos. They went into this thinking that it would be a sort of one and done type of operation, that they would go in, slaughter the supreme leader and the senior commanders, create a power vacuum, chaos would ensue, regime would collapse, and then that would be the end game. But of course, while they did succeed in decapitating the regime, they didn't seem to realize that the regime is not so simple in terms of destroying it. So, this sort of oversimplification, if you will, of thinking about foreign policy in the Trump administration has come back to haunt them in this particular case.
Uh, this, do you think this is a failure of the Iranian regime that they were unable to protect their own supreme leader, their own top leadership of IRGC, and of course the besieged forces and everything? Because we have seen that since the start of the war in Gaza, when they came to retaliate, the Israelis, when they retaliated against the Hezbollah, it was 1 week and they decimated, decapitated all the top leadership of Hezbollah. And when it came to Iran I mean, they were able to strike right inside, deep inside Tehran, and Ismail Hania was there, and they killed him there. And then in this current conflict, we see that they are like striking at the heart of the regime, and the regime is unable to protect. And then, of course, during these early January protests, we saw that a lot of subversive elements were present. So it's from a security perspective, is it a failure of the Iranian intelligence to prevent these kinds of sleeper cells from prospering?
I would certainly say that given that Iran has a very vast and varied internal security apparatus, uh, its inability to stop penetration of its internal machinery by the Israelis and the United States is a major intelligence failure. And I think this also points to the fact that within Iran, economic conditions, social conditions, and the repressive behavior of the regime has actually alienated a lot of people. This doesn't mean that those people are going to like actively join and start a civil war when the Americans are attacking, but it does mean that there is tremendous discontent against the regime. And that discontent is something that boils over every few years into major protests. And those major protests are then put down with an iron hand by the regime. And then a few years later, they repeat this particular process. So that discontent is definitely there. And it is this discontent that might eventually bring down the Islamic Republic in another 5 years or 10 years or whatever have you, or maybe even sooner than that. So it is a major challenge for the Iranians. Then, of course, we also need to consider something else. Uh, the Iranians are engaged in an open-ended conflict with two nuclear powers, the United States and Israel. Iran's own nuclear program is technically the bone of contention between Iran and the Western powers. The Iranians have failed to develop a nuclear deterrent. And that failure to have an actual nuclear deterrent is what then enables the Israelis and the Americans to think that we have escalation dominance over Iran, so we can potentially engage in this kind of activity directly against them. So I have a feeling that if the current regime in Iran survives its ordeal with the United States and Israel, there is a very great chance that the Iranians will now go for a nuclear weapon, that they will actually try to cross the final threshold because their negotiations with the United States, with the broader JCPOA framework, that was repudiated by the United States. They did not get the sanctions relief. They have been attacked not once but twice now by the Israelis and the United States. So clearly, uh, the Iranian strategy of using its nuclear program as a mechanism for getting sanctions relief in exchange for not fully developing that nuclear program to weaponization. That policy has clearly failed. It is a big failure of the Iranian grand strategy. And I think after this war, the Iranians will have no choice but to rectify this failure.
Do you think that there's going to be another, like after this war, they're gonna get a chance to develop a weapon because the Americans they're talking about going in and getting all the uranium and coming out?
That would require the United States to not only send troops on the ground, but it would require the United States to send a lot of troops on the ground because I imagine the Iranians are not keeping their nuclear stockpiles in a grocery store. They are keeping it in places where it is not easy for anyone to get. Also, if you look at Iran's geography, you actually can see that Iran is in many ways a natural fortress, thanks to the Zagros Mountains.
Mm.
So it is not actually the kind of terrain in which US forces would be particularly good at working, as we saw in Afghanistan, for example. So I don't think that this idea of the Americans sending ground troops into Iran is a serious idea unless the Americans want to take thousands of casualties, and very quickly, I might add. The other thing is that actually going into Iran in a limited way to try and clean up its reserves of these things is again not very realistic. How will you transport it out exactly while the Iranians are fighting you? The only condition in which the Iranians would do this is if they actually unconditionally surrender to the United States. And as part of that surrender agreement, they agree not only to give up all their ballistic missiles, but they also agree to surrender all of their nuclear equipment and assets and anything that can potentially be used to develop a nuclear weapon to the United States. But I don't think the Iranians are going to surrender unconditionally or conditionally, even.
Can Iran fight on all of these fronts against USA, Israel, KSA, Qatar, Bahrain, UAE, all of these countries in the Middle East? Iran is attacking virtually every country in the Middle East. Can Iran do that? Because if UAE and Qatar and all of these countries, they also start to retaliate against Iran, it's going to
You know,
create a huge mess.
the funny thing is that literally every week we wake up to the news that Israel has bombed Syria, Israel has bombed Lebanon, Israel has bombed Palestine, Israel has bombed Iraq, Israel has bombed Yemen. Uh, And nobody seems to think that the Israelis bombing all their neighbors is a problem.
Yeah.
So, if you're getting bombed by the Israelis whenever they feel like it means you do not have the ability to defend yourself. So, if you start getting bombed by the Iranians as well, then that is an indicator that your security arrangements are not working. That even with all the heavy military spending, even with all the US bases, even with all the highly advanced surveillance and radars and Patriot systems and THAAD systems and God knows whatnot, it's not actually possible to have security without an accommodation with the Iranians
In the Middle East.
in the Middle East.
Mm.
In this specific instance, the hostilities were clearly initiated by the United States and Israel. So there is no doubt about who has struck the first blow. The American intelligence estimate has also indicated that there was no evidence that Iran was planning to launch any sort of preemptive maneuver against either the Israelis or the United States. So, in this case, it is very clear who the aggressor is. Now, if there are Arab countries such as the Gulf states that have large US presence from which the United States is operating, from which the United States is depending for its logistics, for the surveillance that it needs to protect primarily Israel and secondarily its other Gulf allies, then the Gulf states do become legitimate targets for the Iranians in Iranian self defense. because Iran obviously does not have the ability to directly hit the United States. It does have the ability to directly hit Israel, which it is doing also, but it can therefore only retaliate against the United States where there is a US military presence. And that US military presence is all over that particular region. And so that is the pressure point against which the Iranians will naturally act. I've also been seeing that there is a lot of resentment in the Gulf states about the fact that they were not properly consulted about the American attack on Iran. And that even as the war between the Iranians and the Americans and the Israelis now enters its ninth and 10th days, uh, they are not eager to directly engage the Iranians. So this in turn basically shows that the Iranians have largely limited their strikes to targets which are related to the Israeli or the American presence. There have been very, very few civilian casualties in the Gulf states. There have been a lot more civilian casualties in Iran, including the
Mm.
girls' school that was bombed by the United States. So I think on balance, uh, the Iranians can be said to be acting legitimately in their self-defense. And now the question, of course, which now arises for the Gulf states is this. If the American presence does not guarantee your security, then what can guarantee your security? And I think the answer to that, which is slowly emerging, is that you essentially need a regional security agreement. And in that regional security agreement, you would need the Gulf states to become genuinely neutral territories. And by genuinely neutral territories, it would mean that nobody, whether the Americans or the Iranians or anybody else, is allowed to have military bases and a heavy armed presence on the soil of these countries. But that, of course, is an outcome that will materialize only in the long term, if it does at all, as a consequence of this war.
I was also reading these reports that America pulled out its resources from Gulf countries and placed them in Israel in protection of the, like Israeli airspace and whatnot. And by doing that, America put its own personnel in Gulf countries at risk.
Well, there was reporting, I think, from multiple Western news sources, conservative news sources, like I think Wall Street's Journal
Mm,
and Bloomberg,
mm.
who are obviously not pro-Iran by any stretch of imagination, to the effect that the United States does not have sufficient stockpiles of interceptors, and the United States' allies also do not have sufficient stockpiles of interceptors, that it will take a long time to build additional interceptors. And even if the additional interceptors are built, the total number is likely to be inadequate, and it will take basically the time frame for their delivery is not realistic given this particular conflict. So, in that context, it actually makes perfect sense for the Americans to start rationing their interceptors. And if there is any rationing of the interceptors that is going to take place, it is obviously going to be in favor of the Israelis, not anybody else. And this, I think, is something which has begun to hit the Gulf allies
Very.
that
Mm.
while they are vassal states of the United States in many ways, their feudal lord does not have the same commitment to their defense as their feudal lord has towards the Israelis. So they are second class, let's say, allies of the United States, notwithstanding the fact that these countries buy so much arms from the United States. And notwithstanding the fact that these countries are a huge source of financial investment and circulation for the United States. So, these countries are not actually, dependent upon the United States financially or economically. They're not taking a subsidy, if you will, to be defended. They are, in fact, more than paying for the defense that they are supposed to be receiving in the form of the assets that they have put at the disposal of the United States and in the form of the weapons purchases that they make largely from American and other Western countries.
Why does the US come to the aid of Israel like it does when we talk about the control of the US by Israelis or whatnot? What's there, you know? Why
You
is
know,
it?
I uh,
Hmm,
I actually don't subscribe to the, let's say, semi-conspiratorial view
hmm,
that there is a deep, dark conspiracy, if you will,
yeah.
in which the Israelis have a sort of mind control over the United States. I think it is more a question of Israel being a Euro-American settler colony. And as a Euro-American settler colony, the Americans and the Europeans see Israel as an organic extension of their own societies. So that is why they defend Israel as they would defend themselves. That is why there is no, uh, you know, second-hand treatment of the Israelis, whether it comes to Israel's nuclear program, whether it comes to their defense equipment, whether it comes to intelligence sharing. Israel is, in a way, like the 51st state of the United States. When you look at, for example, the West Bank, I think you have more than 60,000 American settlers in the West Bank. So when we say that the United States and Israel, or the United States or Israel, we seem to be forgetting the fact that Israel is in many ways a physical extension of Western society in the Middle East in a way that colonies used to be in the pre-1945 period. That in many ways, Israel is the last of the great settler colonies of the Western empires. And that is something which gives Israel a lot of traction. So, because it is a part of the West, in a way that Turkey is not a part of the West, in the way that Saudi Arabia is not a part of the West, in the way that even, Japan or South Korea are not a part of the West. That is to say, the Israelis are their blood, and they will do whatever it takes to protect their kith and kin. In a way, they will not act to protect anybody else. And then, of course, you do have the formal lobbying efforts. Because you see, when you look at the rise of the Israel lobby, you see this happening particularly in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, where there is a huge increase in the overall lobbying footprint. But what would then explain the American attachment to the Israelis between 1948 and 1970s? So I would basically argue that yes, of course, Israel has a very, very strong and very well organized and very well entrenched set of interests in the United States, which is very well documented by American scholars and Jewish scholars. So that's not really a point of contention. But I would argue that it isn't simply a question of that money or that organization, that the relationship is actually that of Israel being a blood extension of the West in the Middle East. And that is what enables it to command this level of loyalty.
When we talk about Iran and when we talk about the Palestinian issue, for example, revolutionary Iran, did it espouse the Palestinian cause right away, or did it, like the Palestinian cause came in later, or is there any Palestinian cause in their ideological framework?
I think when we look at the Palestinian cause, we need to be very uh, candid in terms of what happened between 1948 and 1967, before the Israelis occupied the West Bank and Gaza. During that time, the territories that could have become a Palestinian state were under the rule of other Arab countries. But they made no effort to actually declare an independent Palestine,
Yeah,
which they could easily have done.
they did that. Palestine
Once,
Declaration of Palestinian State happened in 1988. I mean,
there you go.
yeah, yeah,
And
quite
by
late.
that time, it didn't really matter because
Yeah,
Palestine had been chewed up and eaten up by the
yeah.
Israelis to a very large extent. So the Palestinian cause, if you will, was pretty much dead as a political or a territorial cause right from 1948 onwards, even when the Arabs had the opportunity to create a Palestinian state if they had wanted to. Once the Israelis occupied it, of course, then there was no question. And different Arab governments then normalized their relationship with the Israelis in exchange for uh, recognizing the Israeli control over Palestine. So I think that this basic dynamic is something which means that the Palestinian cause, as something that could have led to the creation of a Palestinian state, was really a non starter right from the get go. So, in that context, when the Iranians start becoming more interested in it in the 1980s, particularly with reference to the situation in Lebanon and the rise of Hezbollah and other factors, there, of course, we then see the growing espousal of the Palestinian cause by the Iranians. But even there, it really isn't until the Oslo process has completely petered out and been rendered non-functional by what the Israelis are doing that we see in Gaza, at least, the Palestinians once again turning towards armed resistance against the Israelis. And in that context, with the collapse of Iraq and the growing Iranian presence in Iraq, the Iranians gain a kind of corridor all the way to Israel's borders, going through Iraq and Syria and Lebanon. So that then actually makes them a party to this dispute. But directly speaking, that dispute is not something that the Iranians were really involved with when it was starting, or even when it was proceeding throughout the 60s and 70s and 80s. And then later on, once essentially all the hope of a peaceful accommodation is trashed, that is when the more, let's say, militant approach favored by the Iranians comes back to the front and sets the stage for essentially what has now happened, not only in the context of Israel and Gaza, but also Israel and Lebanon.
Uh, Going forward, what do you see? the future of Gaza and the Palestinian cause and whatnot?
Okay, so I think a lot will depend upon how this war turns out.
Yeah, just
When
just let
we,
me add just one question. Can we separate the historical enmity between Iran, Israel, and the US from the Palestinian cause or from what is happening in Gaza or Palestine? I mean, is it all interrelated or is there a certain separate dynamic to it?
so I think that a lot will depend on how this war turns out. Uh, when we look at the period from October 2023 till the February 28, 2026, what we see is that the momentum in this region was moving against Iran's advantage. Hamas did not succeed in terms of defeating the Israelis in Gaza. The other Arab states did not come to the aid of the Palestinians, if that was their calculation. Hezbollah was very badly hurt by the Israelis, sufficiently so that it was forced into a ceasefire, which the Israelis routinely violate without any cost to them. In Syria, the pro-Iranian government of Bashar al-Assad was overthrown, replaced by a, let's say, pro-Israeli government, if we can call it that, but certainly not a pro-Iranian government. The Houthis, again, suffered a lot of strikes from the United States, though it's not clear how much damage they did. Uh, and Iran itself was under very, very punishing sanctions that were creating tremendous economic hardship for its people. So the momentum, if you will, was clearly shifting against the Iranians. And during the 12-day war last year between the Israelis and the Iranians, what we basically saw was the Israelis gaining control of Iran's skies and essentially flying free over Iran for 12 days. The Israelis, of course, did not have the firepower needed to actually trigger a collapse of the regime or the such things. But when the Americans intervened, it provided a kind of full stop, if you will, to that particular episode. So, if we look at the situation at the end of 2025, you could think that basically the Israelis had a lot to be happy about. They had done whatever they wanted to do in Gaza without any consequences. They had hurt Hezbollah, they had overthrown Bashar al Assad, they had apparently cut Iran down to size as well. But as it so often happens, the momentum shifts when the victor in the earlier phase overextends themselves. And I think that is what has now happened. That the Israelis and the United States, thinking out of great hubris that Iran is on the verge of collapse, have ended up invading Iranian airspace, trying to bomb it into submission. And because of the US's involvement in it, it has opened up not just Israel, but the entire region to Iranian retaliation because of the US presence. And that has meant that it has been much harder to defend against the Israelis, against the Iranians, because they have so many more targets to strike. So that momentum that was previously moving in one direction appears to now have broken. If the current war continues, let us say, for another month, we are looking at global economic damage on a massive scale, comparable perhaps to what happened during the early phase of COVID, maybe even more than that. We are looking at instability throughout the region. We are looking at a situation where the expatriate element, particularly the Western expatriate element in the Gulf states, is all going to go home.
Hmm.
We are looking at a severe degradation of the promise of these Gulf states as islands of stability. So we're looking at a regional meltdown and potentially even a global economic meltdown arising from this conflict. Now, the Iranians, because they have already been punished so severely and pushed against the wall, have no option but to fight. I'll give you a quote from Zhou Enlai, the great Chinese statesman who was China's premier under Mao. In 1927, when China's communist revolution was just beginning, Zhou Enlai said that if we do not fight, we will die. If we fight, we might die, but we might win. And I think the Iranians are now precisely operating in that mindset. So the normal calculus of pain and gain that applies to the other Arab countries is not really applying to the Iranians. They appear to have learned very valuable lessons from what happened last June. They appear to have adapted their strategy accordingly, and they appear to be now effectively inflicting unacceptable losses on their adversaries, main allies in this region. So, if the Iranians are able to win this, I think you are going to see perhaps an unraveling of the American security architecture in this region. And that would, of course, mean that Israel is the one that will be cut down to size.
What?
This may or may not lead to any change in the condition of the Palestinians, but it will certainly mean that the Israeli influence in this region will be greatly reduced. So I think in this respect, when we, think about this conflict really is not Palestine centric. Even if the trigger for this conflict came from Hamas's attack on Israel and then the Israeli retaliation to that attack after the 7th of October 2023. So that might have been the trigger, but that is not something that is actually now really material to this conflict playing out. So the way I see it, this is more of a conflict between Iran as a regional power, as a regional state that wants to diminish Western influence in the region because it sees itself to be in a position to fill the resulting vacuum, and an assortment of other states that are now trapped between Israeli and American overextension and Iranian resolve to either prevail or go down fighting. So this is something which is not what the Gulf states in particular would consider conducive to their own long-term survival, because they are going to be turned into a battleground. And the longer this lasts, the worse it will become for them. And they have a lot to lose.
What does a win for Iran look like to you?
I think a win for Iran will have three elements. Number one, the United States is forced to cease fire without any formal agreement from the Iranians beyond an agreement to resume talking to the Americans. So, in a
Okay.
sense, a practically unconditional ceasefire by the United States would signal its military failure. The collapse of the American security architecture in this region would signal a political and strategic failure. So I think for the Iranians, in the first instance, survival will be victory. And in the second instance, victory will mean that the American presence in this region will not be able to survive in its current form.
Do you think Turkey is going to become a target anywhere in all of this? Because I was reading something about that in Wall Street.
Well, the thing with the Israelis is they can target anyone.
Mm.
So if Qatar can be attacked by the Israelis, then certainly Turkey can be attacked by the Israelis. So I think, you know, that impunity with which the Israelis can operate in this region, that is something which, in a way, has come to define this region over the last 10 or 15 years. And the only power that does not allow the Israelis to operate with impunity has been Iran. So, whatever you think about Iran or its regime or its system of government or its social order or whatever, the fact is that it is the only power that is really resisting this arrangement in this region. The Turks are not resisting this arrangement in this region.
Mm.
So even if Turkey has the capability, it does not have the will. During the genocide in Gaza, it had a golden opportunity to actually emerge as a leader of Muslim opinion and intervene on behalf of the people of Gaza. But beyond holding demonstrations and rallies and issuing statements, Turkey really does not seem to have done very much. So I think in that context, the Turks unfortunately fall into the same category as countries like, let's say, Egypt or Jordan or others who basically just looked the other way beyond some rhetorical posturing that they did for their own domestic consumption.
Do you see?
So, so the thing is, the Israelis can certainly attack Turkey, but I don't really see an underlying reason for them to do so, given that the Turks have behaved very well from the Israeli perspective during all the difficulties that Israel has had, first in Gaza and then in Lebanon. So I don't really see the Turks, in a sense, taking up the cause like the uh, Iranians have.
Do you think that the Kurdish population, is it going to align with the US and, sort of rise up against Iranians?
Well, the Kurds unfortunately have a long experience and a bitter experience of being encouraged by Western powers in one instance and then dumped
Yeah.
as soon as they become inconvenient. And at least from what I have seen, if you look at the statements that have been made by the Syrian Kurds, if you look at the statements coming out of the main Iraqi Kurds, they do not seem eager at all to get involved in this.
Yeah, I think
And
the
getting
Iraqis, they put
involved
out a
in this,
yeah.
exactly, they put out a formal, in fact, you can watch the interview of one of their spokesmen on Fox News,
Yeah.
in which he basically said that, we're not enthusiastic about getting involved in this. And others have also pointed out that, even if they were to get involved, they would require a huge amount of resources and equipment and other such things. And all of that would require time to organize. So it's not as if they are ready to just move into Iran and start stirring up trouble there tomorrow just because Mr. Trump has given them a phone call. So that is perhaps not a realistic goal in terms of the time frame in which the Americans are operating.
Yeah. Uh, 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 where do you see the role of Pakistan in all of this? Because I was listening to somebody and they said that if a ground invasion happens, it might happen from the east. So, is there any possibility? And also, for example, when you look at Afghanistan, from what is Pakistan doing with Afghanistan, is there any like relationship between the two? When Pakistan is going all guns blazing against the Taliban, and of course, Pakistan
I
has a strategic partnership with Saudi Arabia as well, because and they discussed it with the CDF. I think yesterday or the day before yesterday.
Yeah. So I think Pakistan right now uh, has a deep commitment to protecting Saudi Arabia specifically. And if Saudi Arabia gets dragged into the war with Iran, then Pakistan will try to do whatever it can to defend Saudi Arabia. But I don't actually see a situation where Pakistani territory is going to be used directly against the Iranians.
Mm,
So even if Pakistan comes to the aid of Saudi Arabia, it will do so more in the shape of a deployment of forces there, sending them assets, sending them naval reinforcements or air power or whatever else they might need in Saudi Arabia to protect them against the Iranians. So that sort of defensive deployment might happen if this war drags out and the whole region explodes and the
mm,
Saudis get dragged into it. But I don't really see a situation where Pakistan will, let's say, give the Americans bases from which to launch attacks into Iran, nor do I see a situation where Pakistani's territory would be used for any sort of direct military operation against the Iranians. So, and again, collapsing Iran is not in Pakistan's national interest. Yes, Iran has been a difficult neighbor for Pakistan at times, but of our neighbors, with Afghanistan to one side and India to the other, Iran has been relatively easier to deal with. And Pakistan has a very big stake in ensuring that there is no collapse of Iran into civil war or anarchy or rival states emerging from its territory. So, in that sense, I think you will see that Pakistan will definitely play the role of a voice of reason both in Tehran and in Riyadh and try to ensure that the Saudi-Iranian détente of the last couple of years continues and survives this current crisis.
I think, Professor, it's time. We have had a long discussion.
Oh, my
Uh,
pleasure.
yeah. I have a lot of questions. I'll definitely, save them for later.
Oh,
We'll def
sure thing.
Yeah, yeah,
Anytime.
yeah. But thank you so much for talking to me, and it was lovely listening to you. And yeah, thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.
Have a good day. Have a good day.
You too. You too.